Good morning. Good morning. I admit the last couple of weeks, my mind has often found itself wondering or going to, our brothers and sisters, those of our church who have been in Israel. And I saw a social media post on Friday that said, I'm finally glad to be back in town. Like somebody had just gotten back in, and I began to think to myself, I'm like, wait a second, I thought they were not coming back till Saturday. Transition sometimes happens, and that's a special kind of transition where you can leave on Saturday and somehow go back in time till Friday. I don't even really understand how that works. That's like Doc Brown, Back to the Future kind of stuff, but that is a major transition. And for myself, I often find that we as people are in a constant state of transition. There are things always happening, things always developing for us daily. This semester, I'm in my last semester at Wake Forest Divinity. And so just like every semester, my schedule changes. So what I had become accustomed to for about 5 to 6 months has kind of been reshuffled and made different. And so I've been adjusting to this new role, this new time that I'm supposed to be there and then be here at the church. And so it was last week when a lot of classes were just kind of getting back in the throw of things that I was at home mid-morning, which is kind of untypical given my last semester. And while I was there, I heard a knock on the door. Now, just like anybody else, like if you're at home and you're not expecting anybody, you're usually having to grab like some socks to put on, you got to fix my hair. I'm trying to get to the door. I've got a baby in one arm. Lauren's trying to hold Fred back. Fred's our 100-pound golden retriever. She did not accomplish that at all. Fred made it to the door with little resistance. So we all get to the door, and I kind of peek my head out, and there are two gentlemen at the door. And so I kind of peek out, and I'm beginning to converse with them and talk with them. And there's an older gentleman and a younger gentleman, and they're like, well, we wanted to stop by this morning. We saw two cars in the parking or in your driveway, and we just wanted to come say hi. That we're coming through the neighborhood, and we have a question for you. I was like, okay, I kind of know where this is going. I'm prepared for it. They asked me, they say, do you know the name of God? And I kind of laughed, and I said, well, I hope so. I'm a pastor, I'm a preacher. I go to divinity school right down the road from here, so I hope I know the name of God. And so we shared a quick laugh about that, and then they began to tell me a little about who they were. And I thanked them before they left. I thanked them for stopping by for a few moments, and they told me they meant no offense by the question, and I told them I didn't take any to that. But I thank them for kind of living out their call in that moment that we just kind of had for a few short minutes on the foot of the steps in front of my house. This very unexpected thing happens, and it kind of led me to a place that I was not. It put me in a place where I thought I knew an answer to something, and it made me go back and re-examine and rethink. You see, for the next few days, I began to kind of hang on that question. Do I know the name of God? Now, I don't think that's something that I'm the only person to ever struggle with. I think that is something that not only Christians, Jewish people, Muslim people, those practicing any type of one of the three major faiths, or really humanity in all, have been asking the question about the divine. Now, how do we put a name on something like that? Now, just from a Jewish Christian perspective, there have been a lot of names for God. And so I knew that there were those. And so I went back and, I think the next day after those gentlemen had left, I began to pull my notes from different courses that I've taken, whether at Campbell University or at Wake Forest. You see, I keep all my notes. I've never thrown any of them away. And so I pulled them out. I'm going back through, and I found through some Old Testament courses some of the names that I had written down that had been given as the name of God. Names like Elohim, and that's a name that we see for God when we're introduced to this God in the creation story in Genesis. This is Elohim that we know nothing about, but is now starting to lay out the creation story and the foundations of the earth and make chaos or take chaos and tame it. There's also the term that we see, just a shorter form of Elohim called El, and that is something that's not even just particular for Christianity. You know, other cultures were using this term, and that Christians also use it. It's more of a generic term for God. And so we find those in places that spoke Aramaic or Ugaritic cultures that we find that name El popping up there. Now there is also maybe a more personal, and we'll get to this idea of sacred soon, but this idea of a sacred name for God. Now this is your big seminary word for the day, and if I get this wrong, you can just ask Nelson or Larry to tell you how I'm supposed to pronounce it. But the tetragrammaton, it's the idea, if you've ever seen the word spelled for God where it's just the YHWH, just the 4 consonants, it's this idea that the name is so holy that you're not supposed to say it. So this name Yahweh, you know, that's how we believe it's supposed to be pronounced, and you see that name obviously translated later in the traditions of the church when the church starts speaking predominantly Latin, we see it translated into Jehovah. Those 2 men that came to my house were probably very familiar with the name Jehovah, although they didn't say that. We see other names come up as well. The idea of Adonai, a translation roughly kind of around the idea of my Lord. And so names like Adonai or Elohim, they become more common, especially for our Jewish ancestors, you know, part of the tradition that we come from, because at some point, particularly after the Babylonian exile, the name for God kind of changes and it gets a little bit bigger to encapsulate all that God is becoming to the Jewish people. You see, before them, this Yahweh was a very stationary type figure. You know, it traveled with them, but was confined to a tent, or it was believed just to be in one region. But when the Jewish people go into exile, they find out that God goes with them. And so the language begins to change. This name of God begins to change a little bit. They become more comfortable using something else. You know, for those that were here on the Wednesday night study this past week, we talked a little bit how language changes from generation to generation. And so when that happens, and this idea that Yahweh is a sacred name, and we begin to replace that because one, it becomes so sacred that Israelites don't want to utter it. And then from the idea that the shift that God has gotten bigger, that those 2 things really kind of play in to that change. Even more Orthodox Jewish people today, when they write out the name God the way we spell it, G-O-D, they leave out the O and they put an exclamation point in its stead. It's that sacred. Now, of course, us Christians, we get some more language for the idea of God when we get into our New Testament. We're introduced to Jesus, the God-man, the Son of God, a name that we see translated from the Jewish name Yeshua, which means Joshua. And from Joshua, it derives from the idea of to rescue or to deliver. And Jesus also gets these titles assigned to him, these offices that he holds. He is often referred to as Emmanuel. We hear that a lot around the Christmas season. We hear the name Emmanuel, God with us. He also holds the title of Christ. That was just not his last name. That was a title that he held, a title or office coming from the Greek Christos and from Messiah, the Mashiach, or the Anointed One. I lay all that out to you, and I'm horrible at languages, so bear with me on that. I lay all that out to you because I want to kind of emphasize that over the years, and over the millenniums, human beings have been trying to name something that's divine, to put a name on it, to come up with a name for God. And I guess through my studies, what I have seen and what I felt I've tried to make sense of is I think it's from that desire to make sense or define or in some ways possess in order to understand our own context. So how do we know what is divine? We have to and where do we fit into that picture? So to know what something else is, we must first understand what we are. And so all those questions after this really 5-minute visits with these 2 men that came to my house, I began to wonder about this name of God and what it really does to us. And so the question I walked away with was, does calling God God, to try and name God, does it limit our ability to know God? Is there a part of God that's supposed to be a mystery to us? I think it's important, especially within the religious context that we're in, the faith community that we were in, and that we see just the language we use when we talk about God. You know, it's not unusual, especially within a Baptist context where we talk about conversion and testimony, and some of the language that we use around that, we often say things like, I felt something, I experienced something. Even certain circles of Christianity, they use language such as, I was born again. What does that mean? This idea that this feeling, there's not really anything concrete around it. It was something that I just experienced for myself. So it's this notion of seeing, not really seeing clearly, but understanding, but not fully understanding. It's something that has to be just felt. Have you ever just felt something was going to happen before it happened? I'm always a person that if I have two choices, I'm typically going to make the wrong choice. Like if I go to a road and I'm supposed to take a right, I somehow take a left, and I know as soon as I take a left that I should have took a right. Happens to me all the time. I see this play out a lot in sports. I can remember just not long ago, I was watching Seth Curry play. Seth Curry played not far from here in his college days, played at Davidson College, and he's probably become the most prolific shooter in the National Basketball Association. I watched a game not long ago of him, and he was given it was a really tight game. It was a close game. It was going to come down to the final seconds, and Curry had been playing well as he had been all game, and there was no question of who was going to take the last shot in the game. And so I was watching it come down. It was about 7 seconds left, and the teams had been going back and forth, and a three was going to win this thing, and I knew he was going to take it, and by the time he hit half court, a thought came to my head that I even said it out loud. I said, you know what? He's just not going to let these other boys win. He's just not going to do it. He's going to hit the shot. Like, it's just not going to happen. Like, I felt that. I knew it was going to happen before it even happened. And of course it did. All the great shooters, whether they be Seth Curry, Michael Jordan, Larry Bird, most of them would say, when I let that one shot go, I knew it was going in even as soon as I let it go. Baseball players say the same thing sometimes. They say, I knew when it hit the bat that it was going out of the park. It's just this idea, this knowing something before it happens, this feeling that they get. I think our conversion and testimony stories are those same kind of moments. This idea, this notion that we feel something, that it's something different, it's an experience, not just something that we have or this easily explained. And in those moments, we have this encountering with God, that reminds us that it's hard to put God in a box, that it's hard to put God into words. Sometimes to know God is only to be able to experience God. The only word that seems to do God justice, any justice, is ineffable. That's an idea that something cannot be really defined, but instead only experienced. Many years ago, I heard a recording of I believe it's an old Texas pastor by the name of S.M. Lockridge. S.M. stood for Shadrach, Meshach, Lockridge. That's a good pastor name. Shadrach, Meshach, that's a tough name. But I heard his sermon, and his sermon was entitled, became very famous. It was called That's My King. And for the whole sermon is actually quite long, but he goes through and gives names for God throughout the entire sermon. So he talks about God being a healer. He talks about God being a comforter. He talks about God being king. He gives all these things, and as the crowd kind of builds up and people are talking back to him and amening, and he gets to the end, and it's almost like a crescendo or maybe a punchline, depending on how you look at it, and he leans in and he says, I wish I could describe him to you, but he's undescribable. And it was a beauty, the way they watched it put all it together, that all the names he could give God and all the descriptions, he still understood that God was somehow undescribable. So I think of that within my own context. How do I understand that kind of idea? Now, I can't tell if my wife's in here or not, so maybe I won't get in any trouble. But so the idea is, I know my wife, Lauren, loves me. Well, maybe on my best days and hopefully on my worst, but I feel that she loves me. Now, that's not something I can work out in a formula on a piece of paper. It's not something that I can, take proof and show you, but I just feel it. I just know that she loves me. And that's the kind of language I like using around those type of feelings and those types of experience. So I think it's safe to say that language, while useful, doesn't always work, but it's the best we have at times when we talk about something that is holy or sacred. Now, there was a professor at the University of Chicago, Mircea Eliade. Now, he was a professor of church history or religious history, and he used this phrase, hierophany. Now, hierophany, this is a really cool word. I like this word because there's a couple definitions around it, but the ones that I kind of pulled out and reworded a little bit, it's this idea that hierophany is the shining through of the sacred into the ordinary. It's when something that is holy unveils itself to us in the mundane. And I like that because I can think about those kind of moments even within my own life. I think about, having to read through, taking English, all through high school and into college. I think about the works of like Henry David Thoreau and Ralph Waldo Emerson, where they talk about being out in nature and encountering stuff. I remember watching Easter morning sunrise at the beach in Wilmington, and the sun was coming up, and I was almost sure that Jesus was coming back in that moment. It was like a fire hit the entire sky. It was absolutely amazing to see. I've seen a holy moment at the birth of my child. It completely changed me. Even this past week, Violet has begun to start to walk. Not very well, but she is stumbling through 2 or 3 steps before she goes down. And for Lauren and I, those are sacred moments. There is something holy happening there. For those who are sports fanatics, they know that this can happen within a collective group of people. It can get really large. In the mid-2000s, I became really a big follower of watching what was happening with the Boston Red Sox. They had been 86 years since they had won a World Series championship, and all of a sudden they had come back from this. They were down 0-3 behind the Yankees, and they came back to win the World Series. And a lot of people wrote about it. Stephen King, who is a New England native, wrote about this experience, that there was just something special about that, and that people with children and grandchildren, that these games lasted really long that they were playing. And when the Boston Red Sox finally won, and that one more out was left to go, people went and woke up their children so they could see it, because it was that sacred to them. Something different was happening that their parents hadn't experienced or their grandparents hadn't experienced. The sacredness can happen at any moment, and I think that's the beauty behind it, because every day something can become sacred, even something like objects. Now, hear these words from the professor I was just talking about. By manifesting the sacred, any object becomes something else, yet it continues to remain itself, for it continues to participate in its surrounding cosmic milieu. A sacred stone remains a stone. Apparently, or more precisely from the profane point of view, nothing distinguishes it from the other stones, but for those to whom a stone reveals itself as sacred, its immediate reality is transmuted into a supernatural reality. Now, if you don't believe any of this, that a stone becomes sacred, men, try to take the wedding ring off your wife right now and throw it away. A stone becomes very sacred. Grandma's pearls become very sacred. They begin to take on a different meaning. They're not just objects anymore. There's something that holds value. There's something that takes us to a different place. Objects become sacred. Buildings can become sacred. In other words, for those who have a religious experience, all nature is capable of revealing itself in a cosmic sacrality. The cosmos in its entirety can become a hierophany. Now, the cosmos in its entirety become a hierophany. I took that lens and that critique and began to look at the Psalms this morning, the one we just read. The Psalms are kind of teaching us, showing us how to worship in the everyday. And so I see this and I look at the words and hear some of these. Look at the way God is described in these moments. That faithfulness is linked to the heights of clouds. That righteousness is linked to the size of mountains. That judgment is like to the unknowable depths. And that refuge not only found under the wings, but in the shadow of the wings. And supplementation is found in the river of God's goodness, and that God, as God's self, is the fountain of light, and the light by which we can see everything. Rudolf Otto was a 20th century theologian from Germany, and he describes the sacred as a mystery of both fearful and fascinating. In the Latin, it sounds really good, mysterium tremendum et fascinans. This idea that The mystery, this idea of the sacred, is both fearful and fascinating. Fearful because of the goodness of God, and fascinating because of the mystery, because it is ineffable. So these Psalms, the way they were written, whether it be by David or someone else, and the way they were preserved, they are given to us as a gift to teach us how to worship. And if so, then being able to worship freely at any time is we have to realize that those moments can happen anywhere. They can happen beside a river. They can happen at the beach while you're seeing the sun come up. They can happen at the base of a mountain before you begin a big hike. They can happen in those small moments, like listening to music in the car with a friend. It can happen like this past weekend where Native American elder Nathan Phillips, in the confrontation between those who were looking to ridicule with bigotry and hate and racism, and he met that, confronted that. Those are holy, holy moments. And because we potentially are in the presence of the ineffable sacred God all the time, we must be looking and be aware of those moments. Now, for those of us that profess a Christian faith, for those of us especially, though, really cling to the idea of the Baptist tradition, this idea of the priesthood of all believers and the importance of the individual personal experience, we are called to a life in this world to show that what is hard to explain can be experienced. And maybe perhaps more importantly, that we can show what appears to be ordinary is actually quite sacred. Amen.